Hartlike goeiedag aan al my hartsmense. Nou, COVID is 'n groot ding wêreldwyd en vir 'n jaar en 'n half het die mensdom sy lewens so te sê verander hoe ons dinge doen. En ons doen en laat in die huis, natuurlik stedelik in die dorpe ook. Maar so ook in ons werksomstandighede, ons werksomgewing. Nou hier is 'n ding wat sy kop uitgesteek het die laaste ruk. En is kommerwekkend. En dit maak baie van die burgers van Suid-Afrika bietjie angswekkend, of maak hulle bietjie op hulle senuwees. En dit gaan oor die vax of die jab, so sommige mense dit noem, en werkgewers, tussen werkgewers en werknemers. Menend, hier's werkgewers wat sê, as jy nie die jab vat nie, kan ons jou ongelukkig nie meer heranstel of re-employ nie. Nou, dit help nie ek kibbel en kabbel oor dit nie. En wat ek goed gedink het is, om natuurlik met 'n regskenner oor hierdie onderwerp te gesels. So ek gaan nou by voorbaat klaar om verskoning vra en dit duidelik maak vandag, dat hierdie video in Afrikaans en Engels de mekaar gaan wees, want die doel hiervan is sodat die meerderheid van mense in Suid-Afrika kan verstaan wat die man hier in my linkerhand van my gaan sê. En hy is niks anders te nie as Richard Botha, oftewel Advokaat Richard Botha nie. Richard, thank you for allowing me to spend a few hours and tapping into your brain with a lot of questions. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure, and hi to your viewers as well.
Hier's baie vrae, maar ek gaan dit nie vra nie. Ek dink jy weet klaar wat om vir ons mense te sê. En ek gaan vir jou vra sonder om verder te skroom. Richard, trek jy weg, gooi hom in Engels. Ons is Engels magtig in hierdie land, ons almal papi. Asseblief help ons, want jy weet daar is 'n gesegde wat sê, as gevolg van 'n gebrek aan kennis, gaan my volk ten gronde. En ek wil asseblief vandag hê, jy moet vir ons 'n bietjie kennis gee. Baie dankie.
You see, I think the situation we've arrived at now is a very interesting situation. We've had a long process where the government has been telling us that it is a voluntary situation. I mean, if we look at vaccination and the whole process of vaccination, we've seen the medical staff that have been vaccinated up until now. It's been a voluntary process.
Essential workers.
Essential workers. It's been a voluntary process. No one's been forced into it. Then we saw that move into the teaching environment. And once again, we saw it was a voluntary process. I'm not quite sure what the uptake was when it comes to the virus, but it would appear that the uptake hasn't been that great because they seem to have spread through the process quite quickly. And I think this is what we may be seeing why the government is beginning to push. I mean, the government put out a proclamation which said that employees should now take on the responsibility of actually getting their employees to take the vaccine.
Vir my, as ek reg is, in my halwe sarkasme, en dit is nie my, ek dink nie dis wat ek eintlik bedoel nie, maar dis hoe my hart voel, it's actually doing a bit of problem shifting now, situation shifting that may occur.
Well, you see, I think a lot of that is taking place. I think because the government is bound. You know, if you think about it, the Constitution is emphatic. It says you have the right to bodily integrity, and you have the right, actually, and it talks about it within our Constitution, you have the right not to be experimented on. Now, we know that these vaccines are experimental. We know that they haven't gone through the normal 15-year process when it comes to the development of vaccines. I mean, these vaccines have been pushed out within 6-7 months. And they admit they're experimental. I mean, the drug companies, the first thing they did before they started this process was get immunity to prosecution for any harm that might be caused.
Exactly.
And the government, I think, has a responsibility to look at those aspects as well, because if they were to force the process, then the liability would fall on them. You see,
Exactly.
so I think you're seeing a lot of liability issues that are going to emerge when it comes to the situation. Now, when it comes to the employer, okay, the employer is bound by a labor contract. I mean, he started a contract off with his employee, and that contract can't just be changed. It has to be changed with agreement between the two parties. I think that should the employers start forcing these situations, they're going to run into a problem there when it comes to the viability of changing that contract, unless of course people are willing to change it and willing to take the jab, which is their right. But I think what we're talking about today is those employees that don't want to take it. Now, my suggestion is this, that you have a right to deny the employer a change of contract, because this goes against the constitutional prerogative of bodily integrity. I can't see how an employer would get around that, especially bodily integrity for a substance that is still in experimental stage. Now, once it goes through its full trial period and everything like that, I think if we don't see harm emerging and the vaccine is doing what it says it should do, then I think as the employee, you might start losing ground a bit. If it doesn't, and as in some cases in many of the other countries where harm has emerged, then of course you're exonerated and you have the right to not take that risk. I think, however, the situation we're heading into for the employer is that when it comes to a situation where he uses coercion to try and force an employee to take the jab, he's stepping into a very precarious environment, because we know that in labor law the relationship between employer and employee is not an equal relationship, because the employer has a hold on your ability to eat, basically, because that is where you earn your income. We're stepping into an environment where if he uses too much coercion, that could turn around and bite him if there's any harm that is caused by the vaccine, because the liability could then lie with him. And I don't think many people have looked at this aspect of it, because the government has been emphatic. They've covered their liability, and they've time and time again said, this is voluntary. There is no ways that you have to do it. This is voluntary.
Nobody will be forced to take this vaccine. I want to repeat, nobody will be forced to take this vaccine.
But I think as soon as you step into that environment where an employer starts saying, you have to, and if you don't, you're going to lose your employment, I think then that coercion is in an uneven relationship, and that's going to get him in, that could potentially get them into trouble. If someone were to, and I mean, the harm doesn't have to happen immediately. The harm could happen in 2-3 years' time. And I don't think that workers' compensation would cover that, purely because the vaccine isn't work-related. It is something outside of the work environment. COVID isn't work related. So you might have workers' compensation coming back and saying, well, that isn't covered. So we're heading into very interesting situations, and the law isn't done on this yet. I mean, there's been no court cases on this. Nothing's happened on this yet. And this is a brand new environment that we're dealing with.
Richard, klein boer Afrikaanse vraag. Maklike taal vir my nou. Hier is reeds employers wat te skuldig maak in hierdie tipe gedrag. Wat staan, die groot vraag is dit, wat staan die werknemer? Wat moet hy doen as sy baas, sy werkgewer om te kom en sê, teken nou hier, dat jy gaan nie die werksvat nie, maar dan kan nie met jou werk aangaan nie, of as jy nie die werksvat, jy kan nie werk nie. Wat staan so 'n persoon nou te doen? Wat is die aksie van hier wat hy nou, moet hy 'n labor lawyer gaan sien? Wat moet nou gebeur?
You see, our labour relations is covered firstly by CCMA, okay? That is your first process. If an employer makes you do something that is illegal, or that is against your will. Just remember, the Constitution allows for non-discrimination based on beliefs and based on opinions and all those. There's a whole bunch of them, you know, gender, sex, all those, and part of those is your right of belief and conscience and opinion, basically, that you have the right to your own opinion, and they cannot discriminate against you based on that opinion. So if you are of the opinion that you don't need to take the vaccine and you don't want to take the vaccine because it is you feel that is still experimental and there's not enough known about it, if the employee fires you because of that, if he says you're no longer employed, you have recourse against him under the current labor law. Okay, you have the right to wrongful dismissal, all those sort of processes, because he's making you do something that is outside the scope of your employment. I mean, this has got nothing to do with your employment. Yes, the government is saying that the employer has the responsibility to create a safe environment, and I mean, this is what the Minister of Labour actually said, that under the premise of Section 8 and 9 of the Labour Act to create a safe environment and all those sort of things, that the employer has to get the employees to take the vaccine. But then right after that, she also indicated that it's still, however, voluntary. You see, they know that it cannot be forced. They know that this is experimental.
Soos ek reg as ek jou vra, jammer van die rede, is dit nog steeds hierdie tipe gedrag wat werkgewers sal aanskuldig maak, sou hulle besluit om maar nie weer te herinstel of te dreig jy vat die werks of vat jy goed en waai nie. It is still unlawful, unconstitutional. Wat is die regte woord? It's still
unlawful and unconstitutional.
So daar het jy dit mense, ek dink dis wat belangrik is ons hoor van 'n advokaat daar vandag hierso. Unlawful and unconstitutional. Werkgewers, luister duidelik. Dit is unlawful en unconstitutional. Richard, jackpot vraag. Belangrike vraag hierdie. En ek wil hê julle moet ook nou mooi luister. Ek wil hê regeringsamptenare moet nou luister, man op die straat moet luister, en die werkgewer moet nou luister. Where does the liability lies? When a person takes the vax and something goes horribly wrong due to the vaccination or the jab.
Well, you see, currently, if you look at the way that it's set up, and if we listen to what has been said, The liability when it comes to the vaccination company is covered through the indemnity form that you sign, because you admit that you know that it is an experimental drug and it's in an experimental process, and therefore you indemnify them of any harm that might be caused.
Can you just rephrase that to me? You admit that this is...
You know that this is an experimental process.
So it says it's an experimental process.
Yes. Because these drugs have not gone through the normal vetting process.
Nou as jy dit nie geweet het nie, dan weet jy dit nou. This drug, this vaccination is an experimental, is still an experimental process.
Yes.
Daai het hulle dit.
I mean, it's common knowledge that that it is still in its experimental stage, and that they don't know what the long-term harm or any of those things are when it comes to the virus. Now, when it comes to the state has made recommendations, but they haven't forced. I think we've heard it time and time again from state officials. We've heard it from ministers that this is a voluntary process. And I think the very first vaccine that was issued in South Africa was quite interesting. It was a doctor, a black female doctor. And her words, as soon as she was finished, she says, "I don't mind being part of this experiment."
Sure.
You see, that is consent to form part of an experiment. So, and as soon as you consent to it, the liability falls away. So that is how the state is also covering itself when it comes to liability, in that they're saying this is a voluntary process. They inform you that this is experimental. When you see the form, it's experimental, everything. You're informed, so therefore it's your consent. Now when it comes to the relationship between their employer and employee, it's a very interesting dynamic. Now just remember, there's no case law in this yet. So all what we are giving you now is speculation as to the way the courts will go. But based on past case law and all those sort of things, when it comes to relationships between employer and employee and coercion by an employer, it's a different dynamic, because the hold that their employee or employer has over you, because it's not an even relationship. We see that in a lot of cases when it comes to sexual harassment and all these sort of things, where employers have claimed that no, she conceded, and the courts recognize the fact that it isn't an even relationship, and there was no real consent. This could fall into that realm as well, where an employee, fearing that he may lose his job, concedes to the pressure that their employer is putting on him to take the jab. And let's say, heaven forbid, that a person takes the jab and they end up with one of the many harms that are beginning to emerge when it comes to some of these vaccines. I mean, J&J, the blood clotting, Pfizer with myocarditis, and all these different effects the side effects that are emerging with some people. We don't know what percentage it is yet, because we're still in experimental stage. We don't know what the long-term effects are going to be. But the liability could potentially, because of that relationship and because this is being forced, the liability could potentially lie with the employer.
Sure.
And I mean that if we look at a small to medium enterprise, let's say you have 50 employees and 3 of them die. I mean, that liability could be quite excessive.
Yeah.
And if you look at the insurance policies and everything like that, the liability stops with an accident happening during the performing the function on the job. I don't know if it would go so far as to cover you're forcing a vaccine. And I mean, you just need one of those, and the insurance company decides that it would rather not pay out because it's not work-related.
Yeah.
And you could have a 10, 15 million lawsuit on your hands as a company that could devastate your company.
Sure.
I'm just saying that is the potential that could perhaps happen should this end up in a court of law.
Richard, ek gaan nou 'n situasie verduidelik, 'n moontlike situasie wat kan gebeur. In 'n werksituasie het ons nou vir 'n maatskappy as 'n voorbeeld of 'n werkspan, het jy die mense wat die inenting gevat het en die groep het nie die inenting gevat nie. Maar dit kan gebeur dat die werkgewer sê, okay, julle wat die inenting gevat het, julle is in daai hoekie, in die veiligheidshoekie, en die wat nie die inenting gevat het nie, julle is in daai hoekie, in die onveilige hoekie. Eintlik wat ek vir jou probeer sê is dat daar 'n vorm is van polarisasie. Meaning daar is 'n skeiding, 'n skeiding wat plaasvind. Wat nou?
Well, you see, I find that a difficult situation from a legal point of view, because, I mean, if we look at what's happened with the Delta variant that has come out, I mean, it is being spread by the vaccinated as well as the unvaccinated. So for an employer to start discriminating, there has to be a valid reason for that discrimination. And if he doesn't have a valid reason for that discrimination, then he's making himself liable to prosecution through the Labour Relations Act. Unfair, he could end up with unfair dismissal and all those sort of stuff if a person feels that they're being isolated and it's affecting them mentally and all those sort of things. He could potentially open himself up for a constructive dismissal. Look, it's a very difficult situation, because he would have to be abreast of all that is happening and all the scientific findings and everything like that to make sure that he's not unfairly discriminating.
Yeah.
Because I think the CDC has already come up with a finding that when it comes to the Delta variant, that both the vaccinated and the unvaccinated are spreading the variant equally.
Yeah.
That there's no difference between the virus load between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated.
Yeah.
So, it would be a difficult situation, but it would have to be a valid reason. Now, he could argue that the state has said, and then the liability falls on the state again, because the state has now said you have to separate the two.
Yeah.
But they haven't said that.
Yeah.
They've just said you need to practice the proper health procedures, which means social distancing and everything like that. So I don't know if they could treat the two groups separately. I don't know. That the scientists, still need to try and work out. But I can tell you, if what the CDC has said recently, that it's equal spread, and the only difference is those that are unvaccinated to have a higher chance of ending up in hospital and that sort of thing, I think it's going to be very difficult for an employer to discriminate by treating the unvaccinated totally different to the vaccinated.
Richard, as ek nou jou mooi uitluister nou, en ek luister met 'n baie fyn oor na die regsaspek, kan hierdie 'n baie groot tamaletjie word vir die werkgewer of for the employer. Meaning, hulle sal baie versigtig moet wees wat hulle doen en hoe hulle dit gaan doen, want jy kan vir jouself 'n lat gaan pluk wat jou gaan kos. So dit is nie dood so maklik en eenvoudig soos wat werkgewers gedink het dit is om net vir mense te sê, as jy nie die werks vat nie, vat jy goed en trek vir herre.
You see, because this is a brand new environment, it is uncharted territory. Law is a situation where it develops through events and everything like that, and
As a vaccination also.
Any
vaccination.
And I mean, if you look at the COVID virus, I mean, if we look at how it's developed and how the knowledge around it has developed, what we knew a year and a half ago is totally different to what we know today.
Absolutely.
Yet you as an employer are going to make decisions on what we know today. But what we know today might be totally different to what we know in a year's time.
Yeah.
And I mean, we've heard the scientists make predictions and make announcements and all these things, and we've heard them change these announcements. So we know it's not an exact science, and we know that it is a very tricky environment. Now, labor relations have developed over years, and those aspects have been developed over years. You're now introducing a brand new element into this labor relation, an element of force. Now we've seen, where mines, for instance, force drug tests on individuals in order to secure their safety and things like that. The difference, however, between those and this situation is those situation, it's a innocuous process that isn't going to affect the health of a person or anything like that, and it's ultimately for the safety. This is a process that could potentially affect the health of a person. I mean, if we look at what's happened with the blood clots and everything, many of the situations that have ended up in blood clots, people weren't even aware of a problem. And that problem emerged afterwards, and dire consequences. I mean, people have died from it. Dire consequences. Yes, very small numbers, as I've said, and all those sort of things. But what if that one is in your company?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what you got to think about.
Yeah.
What if that one is in my company, and the insurance won't cover it because it doesn't form part of the daily work process? Because there's nothing in these things about covering a person for their own disease. I mean, it doesn't exist in any workers' insurance. You know what I mean? So we're sitting with those situations which are rather precarious.
Yeah.
And which way is the law going to go? Yeah. Now, from my point of view, I think there's certain aspects that the law would have to look at, and once again, like I said earlier, the coercion part of it. Did the person voluntarily take it, or was he coerced into taking it because of the uneven relationship?
Richard, jy het nou 'n term en 'n woord gebruik 'n paar keer nou terwyl ek nou gesels het, en dit is coerced. Kan jy net vir my verduidelik wat verstaan jy in Afrikaans, as jy nou omgee nie, onder coerce?
Okay, when it comes to an employer-employee relationship, undue coercion is where you put so much pressure on a person that they consent to something which they wouldn't normally consent to because of the fear of the potential outcome by not agreeing to it.
Ek verstaan nou baie beter. En ek dink die mense verstaan ek nou baie beter. Partykeer is dit as gevolg van druk. 'n terme soos groepsdruk. Doen jy partykeer goed wat jy nie graag wou doen nie, uit vrees uit. Meaning you knew it wasn't right, but you did it to please the rest of the people. En ek dink is amper dieselfde ding.
Well, you see, because of the relationship between employer and employee, as mentioned earlier, it's been recognized by the courts already that it's an uneven relationship because of the hold that an employer has over an employee, especially at times like this where you're lucky to have a job. I mean, we've seen a lot of people lose their jobs, and we've seen a lot of people become destitute because of what has happened to during COVID. So, I mean, it creates a sense of desperation within the workplace that you need to hold on to what you've got.
And I think this is going to manifest a lot in this coerced decisions, especially in these hard times, economic times in South Africa. We all know that jobs are scarce. So a lot of people are going to say yes because of the current financial situation the country are in. Richard, om mee af te sluit, en ek wil graag jou opinie ook hoor omtrent dit. Ek dink ons moet versigtig wees. Laat ons as die publiek nie mekaar begin polisieer nie. Dis nie ons werk nie. Ons moet mekaar uitlos. Ons moet nie ander mense se werk gaan doen. So, hierdie een moet nie agter hierdie een se skouer gaan kyk en kyk wat is reg en wat is verkeerd nie. Want ons eintlik dryf ons mekaar uit mekaar uit en stoot mekaar weg. As ek kan afsluit, wat is jou denke oor dit?
Well, you see, to me, we have the right to our opinion. It's a constitutional right, and everyone has the right to their own opinion. And the science is not definitive as to the vaccine, as to the viruses or anything. There's no definitive conclusion that has been drawn yet. This is still in an experimental stage. And I think if you think of it, and this is not from a legal point of view, this is just talking my own opinion, from a layman's point of view. You see, if the person has taken the vaccine, according to the company that has issued the vaccine, they are now safe. The person that is taking risk is the person that chooses not to take the vaccine. Now that is our choice. I mean, we have the right to jump out of an aeroplane with a parachute on our back, or not to. I mean, me personally, I would never jump out of a serviceable plane while it is still flying and put my life in a little piece of cloth. You know what I mean? That just doesn't make sense to me. We have the right to get into a car where we could potentially die. I mean, we lose thousands of people every year to car accidents. This is our God-given right to make choices in our life. I mean, that's our God-given right. The Bible tells us very clearly, choose today, good or evil, right, wrong, whatever, but that is your choice. And I think that's how the government is approaching it, by saying it is your choice. It is your voluntary choice. So why is it that when it comes to the employer-employee relationship that should change? Because if the jab works, you're protected if you've taken it. Are you not? And if you're not, why are we utilizing this as a mechanism?
Exactly.
Why aren't we utilizing another mechanism?
Exactly.
You see, so to me, it is a bit of a gray area as to why an employer would feel that he needs to. Because it's been proven, like I said, the CDC has already admitted it, that the vaccinated spread the virus as much as the unvaccinated. There's no differentiation between the two. The only difference is on the outcome. So even if you only allow the vaccinated to go to work, guess what? You're still going to get a spread of the virus. Now, you see, you're sitting with a situation where the science isn't definitive yet, where we don't know what the end result is going to be. So to start demonizing people in a situation where you say you're an anti-vaxxer and you're a vaxxer and all these sort of things, you're going to split society around something that is not defined yet, that we don't know where we're going with it yet. I mean, we're already hearing that a lot of the incidences that are happening are with people that are vaccinated, and they're the ones spreading it. So, and look, there's so many voices out there at the moment. So I think just as people, let's remain humane, and whoever comes out of this at the end of the day, great, you know what I mean? Yeah. But let's allow for a person's own opinions and things like that. Let's not start getting into those situations where we create an environment where we start fearing each other or hating each other or anything like that. It ain't going to do us any good. We've already seen what is happening what happened down in Durban with the riots and everything down there, and I don't think we need that in the whole of South Africa. I don't think that's a healthy environment.
Richard, was my absolute voorreg om by jou te sit vandag.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you, sir, for your advice and for all the answers to a lot of worried people out there in South Africa. Ons het dit nodig, omdat ons is die man op straat. Ons wil vir jou sê dankie vir jou tyd. Jy is 'n advokaat en jy is besig, maar vir jou liefde vir jou medemens in Suid-Afrika en die tyd wat jy bereidwillig was om met my te gesels. Ek sê vir jou namens hierdie mense baie dankie, en dankie vir jou liefde en omgee ook. Want dis oor wat het gaan. Ons moet vir mekaar begin omgee.
Ja.
En ons moet lief wees vir mekaar. Ons moet nie gaan onderskeid tref tussen hierdie ou vat dit en hierdie ou vat dit nie. Ons het soveel probleme klaar, dat eintlik wat ons nou moet doen is, ons moet mekaar se hande vat, en ons moet mekaar nie oordeel en die ander man se besluit nie. Wat ons wel moet onthou is, elke mens het 'n keuse op sy eie lewe en sy gesondheid en wat hy daarmee doen. Baie dankie, Richard.
Thank you.
Goed gaan.
So.
Ramkat groete. Goedheid en guns.